makes sense for our organization. Um, we really tapped into our cultural perspective and our views in terms of how we manage and we run things. So we've always ran more as a like tribal council than as a 501c3 nonprofit, yet we always had to figure out how to fit that within the work we did. We start off our executive board meetings with having our elders speak, sometimes with burning copal or burning sage, and really setting that stage um, around the work we do. And so as we continue to grow and move into the long-term planning of the organization, we really wanted to look at alternatives and be very very clear about how we run and manage our organization. So that led me to doing some research, and I found the nonprofit democracy network that Simon is co-founder of, and just opened up a whole new world of different non-hierarchical structures, and met some incredible organizations from across the country who are doing similar things. And it was incredibly exciting. So I've been really just blessed to have found that group of folks, and Simon in particular, over the last few years. And it really shifted the way that our organization saw what we were doing as we continue to grow. One of the things that was really important for us as a POC led organization was to be true to who we are as a people, and to find a management structure that made sense and makes sense for us and for our community. And so Simon, who has been incredible, and came and did a workshop for us, really help launch that conversation among our group and among our team, and is someone who I've reached out to continue to support and guide this process as our organization continues to move into a worker-directed nonprofit. And so when we were able to look at these workshops, I was super excited to have the opportunity to bring him in and to just offer that as well to the larger group in our city. Because I think a lot of us, as we mentioned earlier, as I heard in the conversation, we realized that a lot of these structures no longer serve us, and we're really trying to figure out how to mirror the work that we're trying to do in the community within our organization as well. We're trying to have that same level of care for those who work for the organization as what we're trying to offer out in the community. So Simon Mont is an alternative economies lawyer who has a decade of experience facilitating diverse groups. He helped found the law centers, the Sustainable Economy Law Center's Work Self-Directed Nonprofit Program and the Nonprofit Democracy Network. And I'm really excited for you all to meet him, and thank you for taking the time to join us this morning. Simon, I don't know if I had a chance to formally introduce you to Katie McCleary. She's our co-host, co-facilitator today, and we are super excited to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks Estella, thanks Katie, thanks everybody for coming and hanging out, and by your presence, I'm making an assumption that there's something inside of you longing for the kind of beautiful, thriving, just world that our hearts share a vision of, and that we're working toward that. So I really honor you all and bow, and it's really beautiful to be in community with you all for this little moment. I'll share a couple more words just about myself and who I am, and then I'll ask for folks to kind of, unfortunately we can't be in the room, and I don't have all the time in the world to really get to know each other, but do a quick little Zoom chat intro. I think how do we introduce ourselves to each other? One arc of I was a school teacher, then I went to law school. I wanted to do anti-mass incarceration, anti-school to prison pipeline stuff. So I did community restorative justice work and restorative justice in prisons. And I was going to be a public defender and was kind of doing a lot of, grassroots organizing kind of stuff in Oakland, where I lived for years. And then in that process, just noticed how a lot of our movement organizations were recreating a lot of the problems that we were trying to solve. It really got really acute for me when I was in the public defender's office and I was having this experience of like, wow, there's like a war going on. If there's going to be a war, I'm really glad that I'm on this side of it, on the public defenders side. That's kind of where my values are aligned, though I recognize ways I could express my values on both sides. But I was glad, but I also was like, felt myself turning into a soldier. And I felt like we were going, like the office was an army. And it was turning me in, affecting my emotions and my kind of soul in a way that was not great for me. So I grateful that for the people who are really doing that, some of the fighting, some of the oppositional, some of the really changing dominant institutions kind of work. And then I kind of found a little more life for myself in this question of how do we create the new things that we want to come into existence. And that led me to the Law Center, and that led me toward thinking about nonprofits. And then after some years doing some work about structures and processes and reading all these books from, reinventing organizations and holacracy and sociocracy and all these other buzzwords that you may or may not know about. There's a whole big field of people rethinking organizations. So I did that for a little while. And then it really led me deeper into the healing side of the work, realizing that in a lot of organizational dynamics and a lot of the things that come up as we try to transition from one way of being to another have a lot to do with our, however you want to put it, your soul journey, your healing journey, your relationship to trauma, your relationship to becoming, whatever narrative you use to understand that process. So I started getting a little deeper into that and getting some formal training in that, trauma aware facilitation and individual trauma repair. And that kind of led me to what I've been doing now. So the past 5 years or so, I've been just helping organizations and helping people kind of hack these problems. And I see, I'm Ashkenazi Jew, I'm white, I'm a man, I have some class privilege, I'm able-bodied. So I carry various forms of privilege into this work. So totally open to people dropping in the chat if there's something that's getting missed that needs to be spoken, or interrupting if there's a way that gets recreated in our space that you need to mention. And then also a lot of my role has become really kind of like an information shuttle, as I go from organization to organization, just picking up little practices, picking up little frames that seem to be helping people and kind of synthesizing them and reflecting them back to people. It's a little bit about me. And then another little piece is, at a base level, what we're talking about is like how we be together while we do stuff. So everybody knows that everybody's got their own wisdom in that, and it's very deep and multidimensional. And everybody's got their different ancestral traditions and their different lineages that they're bringing from that. So we want to honor that and all the wisdom that's already here, and also just name I prepared some material and some stuff. Prepared way more than 2 hours because I assume that we can share y'all the PowerPoint slides and you can kind of go through stuff if it helps. And also some of the angle I decided to kind of orient to a little bit more today was a little bit more of the structure side of it, organizational structure and management structure and governance and decision making, kind of a little more in that, which is a really useful angle. I think is a good complement to a lot of stuff. It's a good value add, but it's not. You could go in the whole thing from the direction of really the individual journey, or be way more relational, way more cultural focused. We could spend a whole time just on the kind of mindset and worldview, and again finding different worldviews that allow us to collaborate in different ways, and that would take us into a much richer conversation about colonialism and white dominant culture and kind of the indigenous wisdoms that are coming forth. That's a whole angle, and just want to kind of pay respect to those different angles that we could do, but we're just can't do everything in 2 hours, and it's probably that angle probably isn't mine to carry, so I'm just gonna do my little thing. So with all of that, hello. Yeah, and as I mentioned, there's a lot we could go into. So I would love if we just to start, if people could drop in the chat, just like a little hello. And if you felt comfortable called to just say a few words about like what brings you here today or what you're hoping to learn. And then I can kind of take a look at that and it'll help me figure out kind of how where we can go. So drop it in the chat, just what brings you here today, what are you hoping to learn, and that'll help me orient. Cool. I'm just gonna reflect some of these as they come for the auditory and verbal amongst us. So some different possibilities for organizational structures. Understand how white dominant cultures influence nonprofit structures and setups. Tired of top-down structures with single leadership. The too many cooks in the kitchen, one unifying leader. That's definitely a pattern as well. Structures that are not rooted in white supremacy. Alternative structures, what to do and not do in establishing an org structure. Diversify, restructure organizations. Great. Thanks, everybody. Awesome. Yeah. Great. Thank you. Feel a little more grounded in kind of where people are at. And then also it's nice to feel like that consciousness of that there's already like the established consciousness of some of the diversity things, some of the white culture things. Thank you. Yeah, feel free to keep them coming. And I'll just say, I really want to, my hope and invitation is for you all to try to help make this as relevant and as possible for you, and to meet you exactly where you're at to the extent that it's possible. It's kind of always a puzzle of like, you know, there's people, you don't know who the people are. What's the useful thing that speaks to all of the people? You know, there's kind of that moment. So I do want to just invite people to ask questions and interrupt, and I'll do my best to kind of like feel into like how much we go into it and how much we kind of stay with the arc of the content. And if Estella and Katie, if I could ask you for your support, if people could drop into the chat like question, if they have a question or something, if you two could help me and just say like, hey, you know, Amanda said there's a question, you know, just so I can kind of help. Cool. Seeing thumbs up. So, hope it's okay. I used your name, Amanda. All right. Cool. I think if there's, based on the things that people said, I think if there's just one thing that people really like ground in, it's that there's a whole history of what it means to be an organization and what it means to be a nonprofit, and a whole network of best practices and a whole institutions that their whole business is teaching people these best practices. And then everybody who comes inside of a nonprofit, if they worked in other nonprofits, have had these experiences of what it's supposed to be like and what it's supposed to look like. There's one point that we take away from this whole thing is almost none of that is actually needed on a legal sense. Almost everything about what a board has to do or what you have to do to get tax exempt status, and what you have, and then there's this more subtle pressure of what you have to do in order to be professional. The vast majority of that is far more flexible than we think. So there's a ton of room of creativity. There's a couple, and there are some ways you can get creative that start to bring you outside the scope of the law. And usually there's ways actually to just work it so it works anyway. And then there's also another just kind of meta question of like, there's what are you allowed to do legally? And then there's this other question of like, what does that look like? And how do you message that to funders or foundations? And how much do you put that out front as a character of your organization? And what do people think of that? And that's kind of a whole nother set of questions that you can kind of navigate. But my experience is that there's a way more flexibility and potential for creativity than most people come to the table thinking that there is. So really just want to invite your creativity in there. With that, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. And there's like totally a part of me right now that really just wants to like really dive into this, like where and why do nonprofits exist the way they exist right now, and how is that connected to the apparatus of the state and the history of white supremacy? That's a important area of nerding out, important area of analysis. I'm probably not going to touch too much on it because it's a little more in the context understanding and a little less in the how, but definitely with it. Cool. You can see this cute little picture. All right. Great. Cool. So I'm going to try to run through this stuff of kind of frame what the issue is, talk about 3 bigger picture tools for how you kind of think about organization as a whole. And they're kind of like building blocks of how to think about designing new organizational structures. Take a look at a few real world examples, a few organizations that have implemented things that highlight different aspects of it, and then end with just some mentioning of some of the common issues that people come up with. Okay. So just wanting to start, there's a lot of ways that people think about what liberation is. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend like, I'm the one who knows. But here's a cool map that helps me think about some things. It's probably familiar to maps that people have seen before. So when we think about liberation, we think about that, however we define it. Our hearts already know, but it's like something about thriving, expression, safety, belonging, connection, opportunity, abundance, something in that space. And there's some level of freedom of expression, freedom of connection, freedom of embodiment going on. And there's these different levels of where that happens and where we get caught in. There's the personal, interpersonal, group or organizational, systemic, and collective. And I'll just talk about in terms of like oppressions. So a personal level of oppression is, the internalized belief or something that's happening inside myself. So if I believe I can't be away, or something happening in my body won't let me move in a certain way because I've been conditioned in some way. It's something happening inside me. It's also, a belief I might have of someone else, a judgment or a bias I have of someone else. It's like internal to the individual. Then there's the interpersonal level, which is when I come into a relationship with one person. It's the place of prejudice. It's the place of like interpersonal exclusion. It's the space of microaggressions, judgments. It's what happens when we're in groups together. We act out of alignment with who we truly are. Then there's kind of the group or organizational level, which is when we come together as a whole group of people and we try to do something together. It could be a community, it could be an organization, it could be a neighborhood block, it could be a team or whatever. Then there's not just the people and the interpersonal things, there's also structures and cultures in place inside the organization that influence the relationships people come into and how they feel like they can be as people, and what they do as a group. And there's a systemic level, which is when there's a whole network of organizations that are all doing things together. That creates dynamics as well. So the food production and distribution system, that's a systemic thing, with power dynamics and inequalities and all sorts of things happening between the various food producers, the various unions and owners and distributors. There's this thing happening. The prison industrial complex is an example. The military industrial complex is an example. So these bigger systems, the United States government, the world economic system, those are things. And then there's a collective level, which is like the space of the collective unconscious, or the space of archetype, the space, if you want to get wooier, it's the space of the shared energetic field. So it's this thing that's kind of permeating and uniting all of these things. And obviously these things aren't easy to separate from one another. But the point to make really is they're all creating and being created by one another, and they all influence one another. And oftentimes when we think about anybody approaches trying to do any kind of liberation work, a lot of us tend to pick one of them as a focus. If people who are healers, we're going to do personal work. We're going to liberate the self, and we're going to do it. We're going to do relational work. We're going to get people together. We're going to share stories. We're going to come into understanding that interpersonal stuff. Or a lot of people do systems work. We're going to create alternative institutions, alternative banking structures. We're going to, change the way that we're going to change legislation. We're going to build new food systems. That's systemic work. And then the collective work is a little harder to point to. There's deep healing work. There's people who are doing collective trauma healing right now, group trauma healing. And then also people who are really working on representation in our stories in the media and how that influences things. So the point is just, these are all creating each other, being created by each other. They're all influencing each other all the time. We already know this. It's just a little map. And it's the reason to point to the map is to just help us feel grounded in the broadest thing of what we're actually doing is something about liberation, and we each have some knowledge of what that is, and it's complicated. But what we're doing today, this is my best attempt at a picture of medicine. What we're trying to do today is we're trying to bring some medicine in and look at what happens when we see the group or the organizational level as the primary point of intervention when we think about what the holistic notion of liberation is. So what changes can we make at the group organizational level? How can those things be of service to the group organizational level? And then also, how can those things help influence interpersonal, personal things? You change something inside an organization, you can change the way people are relating to each other, change the way that people feel about themselves, change the felt sense of what is possible, what skills are building, what muscles we're using, and that shifts everything. And then also, how does that change a systemic level? If for folks familiar, the nonprofit industrial complex, right? If you have a nonprofit organization that is internally completely structured to do whatever a funder says, then there's this systemic power thing, and you're not going to be able to start to deviate outside of the will of that funder in order to get your systemic change. So can you change what's happening inside your organization to set yourself up to be able to make more effective systemic change and more effective collective change? So all these things are happening, and we're just going to look at what happens when you look at this group organizational level and how that might play into things. And the particular angle that we're going to take on it is by talking about governance. I like the word governance because for me, it invokes a little bit more broadness and a little less technicality than management, though there's overlap. I like this definition that came to us from the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute. They're working on state level, like a But the way they define it is it's about how people collectively organize themselves to manage their own affairs, how we share power and responsibilities, how we decide for ourselves about what kind of society we want for the future, and how we implement those decisions. It's about organizing, sharing, deciding, and implementing. So that's what we're talking, how that process works. And I see people in the chat. I just want you to know I can't see the chat because I'm sharing my screen. So if you want to do something, you just let me know. Interrupt me. Okay. And then in the, hopefully these are all right little joke pictures here, but there's two common pitfalls I see inside organizations that inside nonprofits. One is we go overly professionalized. So people and a lot of people fall into it. We come from various peoples, various traditions, various consciousnesses, and then we feel like, oh well, in order to be legit, we have to like we have to be professional, so we're legitimate. Professional is often like very much a code word for whatever kind of white dominant society wants, both in terms of structure and in terms of ways of being and communicating. So these groups, they end up kind of hierarchical, and so that's one thing. And then there's another pitfall where people are kind of naively non-hierarchical. Oftentimes people will reject the hierarchy thing. We'll say, we're just going to be a collective, everybody's going to be equal. And then you get like 20 people in a room, we're all equal and we're all leaders, and there's kind of no structure. And then that breaks down quickly as well. So we're kind of looking for, going to be feeling around for these balances of things. To get a little more specific, the overly professionalized, that white dominant culture, it can look like, the master, you can only communicate in a certain vocabulary, use the kind of words you would learn in a professional school or an American higher education institution. Don't talk the way that you talked wherever you come from or wherever your family's from. Dominance of the written word is another one. Make sure you write things down, record everything. Don't just talk. Whatever you do, don't like express yourself using like real emotion or with embodied movement. This white dominant culture kind of thing. It also creates decision makers that are separated from issues and impacted people, often through a narrative of expertise. So the expert is the funder, and the expert's the person who went and got the degree to be able to do the quantitative analysis on what hunger means theoretically, but the expert isn't like the person who navigated the system who like feeds their family. So we create these different systems that separate decision makers from the direct experience of the issues that impacted people. You also create scarcity of leadership positions. This is another kind of double click on the scarcity of leadership positions. If you have a hierarchy and your notion of a leader is whoever's at the top of the hierarchy, and what a leader means is effectively the ability to tell other people what to do, that's necessarily a scarce position. Everybody can't tell everybody what to do. So now all of a sudden you're going to create something where people are going to compete for these scarce places of empowerment. Whereas we don't actually have to do that. We can create spaces where people can actually express their creative leadership in concert with one another, which is connected to power over. So the notion of power being a dominance. My power is the ability to tell someone to do and to not be told what to do. That's like in the professionalized version in the white dominant space. That's what power is, as opposed to power being the ability to influence things in coherence and respect of all of the various relations and connections that we have, which would be more of a power with. And then people are laborers. People are seen and treated in terms of the role they play inside of their organization, and not everything else about us. That's some of the stuff about overly professionalized. I guess people have some experience of that. People probably also have some experience of naively non-hierarchical. So if anybody's been in a group of 30 people and we're gonna like have endless meetings where we ask for people input 20 times until nobody's grumpy about anything, but like deciding what to order for lunch actually like takes the first 8 hours of a day. So it's unclear, inefficient decision-making, endless meetings and input. And then there can be a struggle uniting behind a common strategy. If you kind of have everybody thinking, I'm just going to kind of do my thing,
then it can very easily become disjointed, and you're no longer a whole that's greater than the sum of your parts. You're just a bunch of parts that happen to hang out together. Then there's these shadow power dynamics, and a woman named Jo Freeman really spelled this out. When was it? When did she write it? Okay, I'm forgetting the name. Forgetting the time, remembering the name. But Jo Freeman wrote an article, Tyranny of Structurelessness. And she was a feminist. And she kind of made this point inside the feminist movement, like, hey, we're all trying to be flat and non-structured. But in the absence, as one of my mentors says, if you don't plan for the power dynamics you want, you will naturally reproduce the power dynamics of the culture you're trying to escape from. So if you don't have a structure, then like the loudest person might start to be the leader, even though they're not a formal leader, they just do it. And then when you look at who's the loudest, who feels the most empowered or entitled to talk and be listened to, and then start noticing, okay, and she noticed that it was a lot about class at that space in the feminist movement. It was like educated women who felt, it was educated white women felt like they could talk, and then it would they naturally formed a shadow hierarchy that was even more subversive to their goals, because it was totally dependent on these identities. So all sorts of like shadow things can happen. Another thing that can happen, factionalism happens a lot. It's like if you don't have a clear way of doing things and it's not transparent, then you like kind of have to, you're always like politically organizing for your perspective, and you're competing, and it's, doesn't really do it. And then unintentional culture can also emerge without, and it can also often sometimes be white dominant because we reproduce that, but it's just this sense of like, if you don't have something in place to create and hold culture because you're all just kind of hanging out, you can really easily unconsciously recreate a lot of stuff. So those are some of the things that we're kind of the issues we're trying to get to. And you can see in either one of these, you can have outcomes you don't want on the interpersonal personal level. You have power over, you have microaggressions, you have nothing that can shift that. You have weird power dynamics happening, and that makes people feel a way, and then you can kind of collapse. And then you can also, you're limited on the systems change level. You can't really, we're not going to be able to develop a new public health system that renders the dehumanizing criminal justice apparatus irrelevant if we can't like get in a room and figure out how to have the meeting. So you kind of have to, you can see how they're connected. And then in those things, again, just starting to bring things into focus, wanting to invite us to think about the tensions inside of organizations, like the ways that things inside of organizations aren't working for us. Generally falling into two categories. There's values and then efficiency effectiveness. So values is like when the way we're being together isn't the way we want to be on Earth. It's just not the thing. So an example of that is, right, a white dominant culture. A white dominant culture. We don't want a white dominant culture because we don't want a white dominant culture. It's a value. Like we don't want that thing. We're trying to change it in the world. We shouldn't be reproducing it in ourselves. Value in and of itself, it matters. Then there's an efficiency effectiveness thing, which is like, this is a problem because it inhibits our ability to do our mission. So, another example, like in the white dominant culture, if you're silencing certain ways of expression and you're silencing certain people, well, then you're not getting those expressions woven into your activities, and you're not getting those people's creativity and leadership, and that creativity and leadership is going to help the whole thing. So you're actually being less effective because you're not bringing that into your organization. And the main reason I want to point to this is to show that they're tied together, and then also to normalize that inside organizations, my experience has been that people tend to be more resonant with one or the other as a justification for changing something. Some people are like, we need to change something because this isn't aligned with our values, period, the end, we got to do it. And that's great. I tend to fall into that camp, actually. I resonate with that a lot. And then there's also the efficiency effectiveness, which is people say, hey, we don't want to, like, our goal is to feed hungry people. So we don't want to spend a whole bunch of time trying to purify ourselves of all of these things, because we need to be more focused on efficiency, more focused on effectiveness. And for those folks, to bring them in, it's really about honoring that there's something wise about that. Like, yes, we do want to stay focused on our external mission. We do want to do that. And then helping people understand the ways that the way our internal breakdowns are actually making it harder for us to do that, our thing. And this can be, again, for those of you all who are especially thinking about how to unite your organization behind a process of potentially changing something, really understanding those two things and like speaking into both of them all the time can bring people together. And it's really easy in conversations when you watch this, it's really easy for people who hold these two values to think they disagree with each other. One person will say, oh, we have these values and we need to be processed. Somebody will say it'll deviate from our mission, and they think they're disagreeing, whereas they're holding different poles of something that's important. It's good consciousness for us.
Can I interrupt, Simon, really quick? Can you go back to that last slide?
I welcome interruption.
So if you go back to that last slide, I see this happen in the criminal justice system all the time. So, and it's interesting in that in the last 4 years under Trump's administration, the sort of one unifying thing that they could get done bipartisan wise was criminal justice reform. And it's fascinating to me that even at, when I go and work in prisons, you have correctional guards and officers and prisoners and social workers and medical. You have this huge variety, right? Because a prison is like a mini society. And so they're all caring for the welfare of prisoners, but that's a value. Their values are getting tested all over the place, and different people's personal values, interpersonal values. And then at a systemic government level, right, you have a lot of conservatives and Republicans who are coming at it from a money argument that they know that the system is extraordinarily expensive, right? And then you have the progressive left that says this is inhumane. And so you see these values rubbing together, and it's interesting because they're unified under the same goal of reform often. And then they seem to be disagreeing, but they're actually trying to get something done and meet in the middle. And then it becomes an efficiency argument all the time. So you see the way that this is happening in that prison system all the time. And I'm really glad that you spoke to that, because it seems easy to get everybody together and we're all working towards one unified goal. It's this all the time.
Yeah.
Between, I think, money and values.
Yeah. And I think the sweet spot in speaking really about the organizational design stuff is, can you design something that's, and I think we can, not only more aligned with our values, but also more effective. And then as we unite people behind it, can we help people break out of the over prioritization of effectiveness? Because that's part of what we've inherited, is the over prioritization of that. So you have to kind of validate and balance. But yeah. So here's a couple just dropping back into like the real organizational context. Just some examples, people are familiar with these things. So in values, we're reproducing inequities, we're denying aspects of ourselves inside organizations, we're having this professionalism, we're devaluing certain types of input. These are issues that are troublesome in and of themselves. And then on the efficiency effectiveness, going to have information bottlenecks. You have a single decision maker. Everything's got to get run through them. They can never keep up with their email. Partially informed decision makers. You have a board of directors that kind of knows about programs, somehow making some like key strategic decision. People are burning out, both in the collective, in the naively non-hierarchical, because it's exhausting to be in those meetings, and in the overly professionalized, because they're not feeling empowered or creative. Slow feedback loops. Your people have spent all their time jockeying for power and not actually just doing the thing that they really want. Wasteful meetings, all that kind of stuff. And just to like real zone in there, in terms of the power over this hierarchical structure, when leadership means having power over someone, well, that power over thing, that structure can reinforce racism, colonization, sexism, all these isms, because there's, first, in terms of why people climb to different places, that's really, as we know, really impacted by identities and histories. And then also, once you're in that above below relationship, if the person who's below in the structure wants to tell the person who's above in the structure that some of their behavior is racist, that's a tense situation, because that person might also dictate your work or your job stability. So it can collapse the possibility for us as humans to repair and actually change that stuff. So there's this reinforcement of all of those isms that it's happening. So that's a reason to change it. And then at the same time, this jockeying for power and people doing unneeded emotional labor. Unneeded, I mean, in the sense of like, we can create structures that are not that harmful, not as harmful, so people don't need to deal with the harm. Well, every time that somebody gets triggered and then they have to spend a few hours of self-care, that's energy that's going into that process that could be going into this creative generative process. So it's, speaking as a little, accountant, that's inefficient in terms of the organizational operations, which to some folks, myself included, feels a little crass of a way to put that. But it's also a way to make the argument to people of why we need to change some stuff so we can have more. We cannot be jockeying for power, and we cannot be having these things occurring, so that we can be more generative. And you'll feel like, even the way I said it, the way I explained that, it totally revealed where my own heart happens to be. I'm like, we got to do it. It's a values thing. We got to do it. And then I'm like, oh, and then there's this argument I have to make to these other people. Like, so that's kind of my sense. But I'm not transparent with that when I work with people on the other side, because the efficiency effectiveness thing is also a real important value. And then just thinking about the connection between the organizational and systemic level of our like initial fractal. Inside the organization, if we're creating equity, we're supporting growth, we're working sustainably, we're enabling healing and transformation. Well, then what we're doing, if we do that right, we're learning how to act mindfully in a different way. We're creating new models. Oftentimes those models in those spaces are like opening up more of the creative expression of ancestral wisdom or feminine wisdom, or the wisdom of body. They're like, we're bringing that more into the world. We're building our capacity to work with that and work together, and we're prototyping solutions, right? Every time, for example, every time a organization goes through a process to radically rethink their compensation structure inside the organization, everybody in that organization learns a whole much more about how poverty works, how money works, how vulnerability works. We up-level the whole thing. And then when we go outside the organization, we're more able to intervene effectively, think systemically, respond to frontline needs, empower communities, and build movements. Because the real movement building is, okay, this is a little, my sense is that real movement building isn't going to be a hierarchy. There's not going to be like a hierarchy. There's going to have to be this fluid, emergent collaboration. So as we develop our ability to do that inside an organization, we develop our ability to do that between organizations and as a collective. So again, these are all frames. My guess is that people who are here are already bought in to some extent on changing what happens inside organizations. These are narratives and frames to help explain that to other people and bring more people in your organization along for that journey.
If I can add something, Simon, I think that part is really important. I think intuitively we felt that we need to, in our organization, needed to really reflect the kind of work that we were doing in the community within our organization. But we didn't really have the framing to do that. We didn't really have the collective language from the board level to the staff to really be able to explain that, or to explain that to the outside funders. So that's one of the things that I found most exciting in working with you and working with the group, was really starting to have collective language around these alternative organizational structures, and just having a deeper knowledge of the different things that are at play within structures. So that's something that I think has been great, and it's one of the things I also just wanted to introduce to our Sacramento community around having some shared language around the just the alternatives to what we've known. And I think you named it in the beginning, which was that we've all often thought that professionalism or an organization needed to look a certain way. And I think a lot of, meeting you and meeting all of the organizations from across the country who are deconstructing their structures was really empowering, and realizing that we weren't alone in our intuitive sense to kind of change things within our organization to be better for the people who ran the organizations, and for it to reflect that outside work. So I just wanted to share that, because I think that was a really important point in terms of just having that shared place to kind of move from and build from.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I think we can also check out nonprofitdemocracynetwork.org. And there's some language on there that's like a group of people who are like, here's our best crack at like a kind of shared narrative. So that's some place that if you want to build as a community, you can take inspiration from. And then inside organizations, the pattern that I've noticed is that every organization develops a different language and develops a different sense of why. So there's some organizations that it's like, let me think of a real one. Like they were doing it and their narrative was, we're doing this because it is tied to our ancestral healing and the authentic expression of our wisdom. And this was a group of femme POC healers. It's like, this is the authentic expression of this energy and this wisdom that we're carrying is into a new structure. That's why we are doing a new structure. And then another organization is like, a venture capital firm. They're like, we are doing this to retain leaders and create, an abundance of leadership opportunities so people can more create it, like bring their full selves. So there's different things, and kind of feeling into what's going to speak to your community is important. Cool. I'm going to stop the share for a sec. I'm like in that moment of like torn between like, there's so many more things we could talk about. And like, I also want to know how we're doing and how that landed. So I wonder if anybody just in the chat wants to drop in either like a question or a new thought, and we'll just take a moment here, even if you want to kind of tune out from what I'm saying and just kind of take that moment to journal or integrate a little bit. And so it's not like a total 2 hours of some dude talking. Cool.
I just want to say, Simon, that I'm really loving everything that you're presenting. And I think one piece that keeps coming back to me is just the idea of authenticity to who you are as an organization and who those people are in the room. And I love this sort of framing of we all carry different wisdoms with us. And so this idea that we should just be doing what we know how to do really well. And so there's a part of this just is giving permission to embrace who you are and the deep gift that you have, and lean really hard into that and stop measuring and comparing to these alternative forms. And I find that full of grace, and I think it's exciting. And I think it's where we're shifting to entirely. Hopefully, well, I won't say entirely as a nation, but I will say where we're shifting to in California and parts of the West Coast.
Edgar, it's enough.
Thank you.
This is Ray from the city. How are you? So I'm listening from two perspectives, both from the city that I've been thrust into work for, this traditional, well, we know what the city is like, and trying to be the liaison between organizations that don't always understand what the city's trying to do. And so I just hope part of the conversation we can have is not only advice to the city, we're trying hard, but it's part of this huge white structure that I'm fighting every day to make easier for everybody. But there's got to be some balance, and we have to figure out how to bridge that gap a little bit. So I'm looking for some help too, as an institution, of how to make this bridge work. So I don't know if that makes sense. Hope so.
Thanks. Yeah. That's a whole nother thing. It's just, I'll point to one way that I think can be helpful to think about it. If there's two organizations, two entities that interface, and one has the power to set the terms of the way that interface occurs, to be cautious about whether the terms of the interface, how deeply that impacts, how deeply it like reaches into the other organization to change it. And an example of this would be like funding requirements and reporting requirements. So if you have incredibly stringent reporting requirement, if you're going to give a grant and it's like just money to do whatever, okay, you haven't reached into the organization at all. You've actually just given something to the organization and now they can go. If you give it with some basic agreements of some programs they might do, you've kind of influenced, but you're still kind of possibly on the outside. You're in a space of collaboration. But the moment you say you're going to have to do a level of, you have to meet specific metrics. Okay, now you're changing the way they design their program because they have to be able to meet those metrics and measure those metrics. And then if you have reporting requirements, let's say it's going to take them 100 hours to report, then you're going even deeper. And now all of a sudden that organization has to build organizational structure to do metrics and reporting. And then because that's tied to funding, you're going to create a situation where inside the organization, the people who are more connected, more proximal to the outside organization can mistakenly start to reproduce the behaviors of the outside organization, and then mistakenly actually become more powerful than the other people inside their organization, because all of a sudden the needs of the funders and the metrics and the quantifiable things are more legitimate because they're more needed. So just, and it doesn't always happen, there's tons of ways to prevent it, but as the external partner to be curious about how deeply you reach in there. Cool. Yeah, and just checking out some of these other things. So, yeah, and part of it's operating and programmatic versus programmatic funding. Part of it's the funding thing, but that's just an example of the way attending to the power dynamics at play as entities come into existence and how that impacts what happens inside of another entity. We're gonna keep on cruising. Let me share the screen again. Cool. So I'm gonna talk about 3 bigger picture tools to think about designing organizations. I'm gonna try to run through them really, really fast so we can spend more time in the like question space and more time with the specific examples, but the slides will be in here. So I'm gonna run through them real fast, but the slides will be in here if you want to go in deeper. And the 3 things that I'll point to are 6 dimensions of organizations to think about. Circles and roles. I put an asterisk because I was going to make a little note to say that circles and roles is really a tool drawn a lot from the space of sociocracy and holacracy, which are nice buzzwords if you're on your Google searches. Sociocracy and holacracy are good ones. And then 5 different forms of what hierarchy can look like inside of organizations. And the intention here isn't to prescribe this is the way that organizations should work. It's to start to give a little bit more content and structure for your own inherent creativity, hoping that supports that. So 6 things that are happening inside of organizations that you can think about, 6 dimensions that you can create or change. Culture, structure, rules, processes, practices, and relationships. And these are things built from kind of a synthesis of the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute. They have some models and some maps. Reinventing Organizations is a book that was written a little while ago. They have a Wikipedia page, a wiki page, Reinventing Organizations wiki, that has a whole bunch of different practices. And then a lot of working with people and direct experience and talking to people. I'm going to say it so I can have said it. And for the holacracy and sociocracy stuff, I think it's a really great tool to go check out, especially when you talk about the structure. I'll talk about when I want. All right. I think it's a really great tool. There's also an article, and I'm sure I can send folks emails with resources afterward. But both of those have some complicated relationships to whiteness themselves. And I wrote an article a while back, Autopsy of a Failed Holacracy, which talks about the ways that we can unintentionally reproduce white dominant culture in the attempt to become non-hierarchical. But 6 dimensions, again, these are just like trying to get a broad view of when we think about what it means to create an organization, what are we actually creating? So we're creating cultures. This is the assumptions, norms, and values that contribute to a social and psychological environment. By the way, everything you're about to see is going to be, all these pictures are my favorite, some of my favorite pieces of street art in Oakland. I'm not going to go on the story about all of the stories behind the street art. We're going to stick to the thing. All right. But yeah, culture, assumptions, norms, and values. So it's like the worldview and cosmology, the language that we use, whether that's, English, Spanish, or what have you, or whether it's the kind of, even if it's in English, there's a certain English spoken in the academy, and there's a certain English spoken in working class families. And they're not to overly generalize, but there's different languages that people are using. Values, stated and unstated, are different traditions. Norms, some of these norms are things to think about, particularly in the context of race, class, gender. How do we feel about conflict? When we talk about stuff, are we talking about anti-oppression? Are we talking about bias? Are we talking about exclusion? Who's welcome? Who feels belonging? So the culture that we're creating. And the structure that we're creating is the formal arrangement of power, responsibilities, autonomy, and accountability. I want to underline formal arrangement. And that article, Autopsy of a Failed Holacracy, really goes in deep on that. There's a formal arrangement of like the agreements we make about who can say what to who and who defers to what about who, when, that we can write down on paper. And then there's all this subterranean stuff happening also about how these things happen. And then you need kind of good communication in order to be able to really touch that stuff. So your structures, like your org chart, your decision-making authority, or your job descriptions, if you have working groups, if you have staff roles, these kind of formal places, it's largely stuff you can like write on a piece of paper or draw a picture about. Tends to be what structure is. And there's processes, which are procedures for accomplishing discrete time-bound tasks that require a coordination and input. Discrete time-bound. A process in this definition, first it's not happening, then it's happening, then it's completed. Hiring is often a process. We're not hiring, we're hiring, and we have a certain way we do that. We get input, we do stuff, then the hiring's done. The next time we start the process again. Strategic planning, budgeting, our processes. And the good thing to notice about our process is because it has a start and end moment, it can be a really good opportunity to practice different ways of being together. So if, for example, you're in an organization that has, single hierarchical leadership, and you want to think about doing something that's more collaborative or participatory, instead of shifting your structure right away, maybe you do your strategic planning process in a way that's highly participatory and where people have different decision-making power. So you do it, you run this experiment, then everybody will learn, you reflect on the experiment, and then maybe after that, you bring things into your whole organization. And it's a way to start experimenting and growing into things without changing the organizational structure, which people often feel like is like what holds us all together. We can't change the whole leadership structure because, well, we won't make payroll. Well, if people are worried about that, maybe just change a process and build the muscle of doing it. So processes, yeah, gave some examples. Practice is an ongoing activity that enables the organization to function. So you're doing practices all the time. You're always doing there's a whole set of stuff that people are doing that keeps the thing moving. So you might be training or coaching each other. You might be facilitating things. It might be, you might have a consensus decision-making process you use. You might have, every Friday is a time everybody meets and does, personal or community care together. So it's like things that are occurring all the time. And again, if you're noticing something, that you want to change inside your organization, you can start by changing a practice instead of a structure. A good example of this was actually the law center where I worked for a little bit. They had a practice of monthly meetings where they would call collective inquiry, and they would just get together and talk about how a topic inside the organization that needed to be explored, that everybody was experiencing. So they do that for 2 hours. And it was a way of coming together. It was a way of uniting, and it was a way of sense making about the organization. They weren't trying to change anything. And they started doing that, and then realized that it was a space for them to like notice patterns and then they would like, in that they noticed everybody was really overwhelmed with email. Nobody knew when they could stop working. So then they made from there, they made a new rule that, you don't respond. Nobody's emails or response to emails between 8 and 8 or something like that. Okay, a rule is an explicit directive. I hope everybody gets the pun about how the Warriors rule. Gotta try to keep it humorous in some level. Cool. So rules an explicit directive. Alignment is expected, cultivated, and sometimes enforced. So these are things like a policy you might write down, but a thing to notice about a rule is it's really nothing without something a practice that keeps people following it. So a rule is like working hours. When do you work? You have time off, or anti-harassment policy is a really good example of a rule that's meaningless unless there's something in the culture and the practice that actually makes that rule implementable. But a rule is also a nice place to start. If you have an idea of something you're trying to achieve, you say, this is how we're going to be together. And then you can kind of let that lead yourself into the process of figuring out how you're going to actually manifest it. And relationships is the presence and quality of the connection between people. So it's like how we be together. I don't know how to define exactly relationship. That's how are we together? And to notice how that is similar or different between people who are collaborating inside the organization, between staff and volunteers, between collaborators and community members, between people who are representing the organization, people representing partners in the organization. And the point about these things is just to notice when there's something in your organization. So what we're creating when you create an organization is an ecosystem of these things. We're creating an ecosystem of culture, structure, processes, practices, rules, and relationships. And this is fluid thing. And then if there's something that we want to change or something that we want to express, we can try to make a shift at any of those different levels. So if there's a conflict, maybe it's a conflict between two people because they're getting on each other's nerves. Maybe the thing to do is to tend to relationships. Maybe the conflict is actually like between, let's say, the grant writer and the programs people, and you think it's a relational thing, but actually there's a structural thing because of who's getting to make decisions about who does what work. So maybe you need to make a change in your structure to do that. Maybe there's something that people really don't feel like a meeting practice is working for them. So maybe you might want to change the way meetings are facilitated on the practice level, but maybe you realize actually people aren't liking the meetings because they don't feel safe and they don't feel belonging because there's a broader cultural issue. So just to kind of notice these things interplay with one another, and hopefully breaking them out just creates a little bit more way to get oriented into the space. Cool. Let's take another sec before I go on and see if there's anything that wants to be said here. Any ahas, any oh no's, any that's ridiculous, any that was a really cool picture. Feel free to, yeah, I know that mural's behind a building. I lived across the street from that mural and had to watch that happen. It was not fun. I'm sorry, I shouldn't talk about the, but yeah, anybody want to make some comments just by means of integration or observation about that little 6 dimensions? Is that helpful? Is that confusing?
No, I think it was really helpful. And I think that a lot of this hinges on the people in the group having a kind of spirit about them of malleability and openness and curiosity, not being certain, not being right, you know, like that's really the key to being with people and connecting with them is an openness. So it seems like a requirement in some ways.
Yeah, and there's a framework called adaptive leadership, which is a nice one. There's some cool pictures about it, but just there's thing like how to adapt when we don't know what the solution is. And my observation I made at this point is that people are just going to be at different levels of interest and capacity for that process. So just like they're going to be at different levels of interest and capacity for designing organizations and thinking about governance, some people just want to come in, they want to, they want to come in, they want to do their work, and then they want to leave and take their creative expression into whatever else. They don't want to do the governance work. So whatever we design actually has to be cool with that. And we can't, if we try to expect everybody to do that, things break down. And then also as we move into new structures, particularly through the transition period, and then when we're in a different structure, to really attend and listen to what people need in order to show up. Because one of the ways that I've seen this break down and again just kind of reproduce all the things again is we say everybody's free, everybody does their thing, everybody's empowered to do their thing, but you give that into a situation where everybody's been has different cultural conditioning and beliefs and experiences being in their power and needs different types of support. Some people need to be lifted up and encouraged. Some people need to be checked and held accountable. So unless you're giving people all that, you're just back in the thing again. Cool.
I wanted to share that, for our organization, I think once we went down this road, we made the decision to go down this road of like, we're going to be very intentional about the restructuring and the naming of the systems that we have in place and aligning them with our values, and making sure they're effective, right? We're still in that balance. We're trying to find the balance between those things. But I think it really sent our organization into a year long of conversations and reflection around what it was that we needed, and what it meant. And we actually ended up setting it up as a 3-year process of really, giving ourselves the time and patience to really restructure intentionally how we want to, what the organizational structure is for the organization and what we're going to leave, what the legacy of Soul Collective is going to be, what we're going to leave in place for the next generation of leadership. And so it's been a 3-year long process. So I wanted to share that because I feel like, it's a lot, and especially if it's new, it's a lot to kind of digest and take in. And I also just want to name that for some folks. And I remember when when I had the ability to walk into a room and really even hear about, the way that, white, supremacy stepped into organizations. I think as a person of color, I had felt those things. I had felt that I was, the way that I was doing was being judged to a certain standard, but I also had never been in a room where people openly spoke about how this affected our organizational structures. And so it was very impactful to hear. I think when I first started stepping into rooms and really hearing people name that, but it was also a lot to process and a lot to digest and a lot to reflect on. So I just want to say that because I don't know where folks are in terms of, you know, doing this work. I know as an organization, we've had the ability to just deep dive and be around other people across the country who have been doing this type of work for a really long time and deconstructing organizations. But I just want to say that because I think if it is the first time some folks are really hearing that, it is a lot to process and a lot to think about and reflect about our own organizations. For our organization, one thing that was really impactful was that we realized like we were trying to replicate white dominant culture as we stepped into another realm of professionalism. And it was a hard pill to swallow as a POC led organization to realize that some of our board members started adopting Robert Rules of Orders instead of, you know, burning the sage, thinking that, okay, as we're growing, we have to be more professional and we have to, you know, so it was kind of like a shock for me to realize, and it was an awkward conversation to have with our board. Like, why are we actually thinking that we have to do this now? So I just want to name that because I don't know where everyone is at with it. And I want to just say, you know, it is a lot to process for our organization. It's been a 3-year process. We've given ourselves the patience to really unpack and look at and reflect and continue to learn about, you know, this ability to redesign and restructure. And as people of color, really dissect that and to understand how some of, you know, white dominant culture has affected us and how we and how we do our work. So I just wanted to put that out there in case anyone is feeling overwhelmed with, you know, new language and new information, that it's okay. And, you know, we've been there, and I just want to say, I know it could feel like a lot.
Yeah. Thanks, Estella. Yeah, there's definitely like people who make big pivots. It's like a couple year. It's usually like at least a year to like do the first gesture of the pivot. like a couple months at least to like build the like awareness of what we might be doing. At least a year to like make a first gesture, and then from there you're constantly evolving. It's not like we're done. And then as for people who are thinking more on that like incremental thing, it's like if you're like, oh, this is kind of cool, I'm kind of vibing with this, but like I'm not going to restructure my whole organization. A couple of things to notice. First, meetings are like a great place to start. Instead of like, how's our organization do everything, just like get people together for an afternoon and say, how do our meetings feel? How do our meetings feel? What's going on in our meetings? Who's talking? Who's not talking? Who feels empowered? Who's not? And usually through that, a whole bunch of dynamics, a whole bunch of what's actually happening inside the organization will become apparent. And then instead of trying to like do the whole restructure, just think about how can we have better meetings. And usually that'll and you'll start to do it'll start to bring a thing. And then if you want to think more on the on like the strategy decision-making level, just think about how you do your strategic plan or yearly priorities. Just that much. Just, can I do that? And like, how do people feel about the way that's being created? Let me hear what they think and what they would want. And can I do something that's a little responsive to that? And that'll start to flex the muscle. And then also, I have never seen an organizational pivot truly work when it is primarily energized by one or two people, especially one or two people who are at the top of a formal hierarchy. Even if it's like an executive director, like the CEO and the COO want to make a thing that's more participatory, and then they like design the thing they think will be more participatory, it's actually just recreating the same thing. It's actually those leaders doing another thing. So there's some process of actually uniting the group and creating kind of a critical mass that's made sense of what's going on and is interested in doing things differently. So there's like and that often can start with like a reading group, a study group, some caucuses, like those small things that allow things to start to happen. And then from there, let it go. Michelle, did you unmute yourself before I just kept talking?
Oh, no, that's okay. I was just gonna ask Estella, what the, what the outcomes were for your organization going through that. Were there, I was curious as to how that has been working and throughout that process.
Yeah, we decided to do a 3-year process, and this was out of actually after the Nonprofit Democracy Network conference, which was really incredible. And Simon was one of the facilitators. And actually in that conference, I realized, like, wow, we've been doing a lot of this work. I've had none of the language. Like, I'm actually an OG in this. We've been experimenting for 15 years, and like, I just have never had language for it. Like, wow, this is really incredible. And they created the space to allow folks to kind of think through, how do you go, what are you going to go back and do with your organization? So the few of us that went from our organization said we're going to do 3 retreats to kind of work with our organization to think through what is a natural next step. What do we want to do? So we did 3 retreats with community, folks who are part of our community, our youth, our neighbors, just our soul community, and introduce some of the information. Actually, first we had Simon come in and introduce some of the concepts to all of our staff, just so that we could have common language again to kind of talk from, and so that we could all kind of be operating with some, from the same place. And so we ended up doing the retreat with the community. Then we did a retreat with our board and one with the staff. And so from those retreats, we decided to do this 3-year process to move into worker directed nonprofit. So we made a collective decision to intentionally explicitly say we're a worker directed nonprofit and this is our structure, and to begin to redesign that. So the first year was last year. It was where I started my move out of the executive director role and moving into a collective leadership role. So that was last year. And so we knew that was going to be a transition that, people were shocked and kind of scared and didn't know what we were doing. And we left space for that to kind of, allow people to step into the unknown. And then, the second year COVID hit. So this year has been kind of a crazy year because we had a plan for, how we wanted to run through things. And then we had to kind of, pivot, right? So where we're at right now is that we are working with 2 consultants, including Simon, into the coming next year to help facilitate and continue to facilitate those conversations within our group. And to redesign, help us redesign what our structures, our processes, what things look like within this worker directed nonprofit. One of the things we realized was we needed clarity around roles and responsibilities. What are our systems of accountability looking like? And as a founder, I realized I wasn't the right person to facilitate those conversations. I really needed to have someone else come in and do that, because there already is on whether I want it to be or not, there's some hierarchy there with me as a founder facilitating those conversations. So I had to really step back from that and have someone else do that. So that's where we're at. We're moving into this next year. It's still an experiment. It's open, it's fluid. And we're bringing in, all of our staff to then have these conversations around what that looks like. So yeah, that's what the experience has been for us. I think there's been a openness and a willingness, I think, based on our collective understanding that we want to structure long-term that's going to really fill the cup of those who are doing the work, so they have capacity then to go out and do the work, and that this structure is going to allow for us to do that, or this, this kind of collective dive into that is going to really help create something that is going to empower those who are doing the work so that they do have the capacity and energy to go out and do the work that we're trying to do out in the community.
Thanks. Yeah. It's so hard to not just have a good conversation, but I do want to go. I'm gonna take us back into the into some of the content, just because I think it'll be, even if we do it fast, it'll be good. So people will have it. appreciate y'all's presence and engagement. That feels good. Cool. So the next tool we're going to talk about is circles and roles. So this is definitely like holacracy or sociocracy. And the key idea is that we're trying to balance coordination and autonomy through transparent allocations of decision-making authority. So coordination being we're going to do some things together, autonomy being you can do the thing you want to do. If you get too tightly coordinated, everybody's got to be on every email chain about everything, and things become stagnant. Or you have a singular person telling everyone what to do, and you get all these weird hierarchy things. Too autonomous, it becomes disjointed. So the idea of circles and roles is to just create different spaces for different kinds of decisions to be made by different people, and to be real and clear about that. So a circle is a group of people, and that people can have fluid membership. So people come in and out of the circle. There's different ways of deciding circle membership. You can do a volunteer, or you can have people assigned to it, to various circles, with articulated purposes and responsibilities and clearly defined scopes of authority. And people are on multiple circles. This picture over here to the right is a circle structure of organization that does anti-hunger. That's a weird way of putting it, but they address hunger in a metropolitan area. So they have a circle that's all staff. So when on there I think 10 people. So when all 10 of them get together, there's certain things that they only decide when the 10 of them are together. Big budgetary decisions, big strategy things, policies that impact everyone. Everybody has to be there. Then they have two circles. They have a team support circle that's there to make sure the organization functions. Community food justice, CFJ, it's like their programmatic thing. And those will meet like once a month. Really, the program's crew will come together and be, how are our programs doing? The team support will come together and be like, what's going on? And then most of the actual work inside the organization happens in these purple ones. So they have three main programs, advocacy circle, services and knowledges, movement building. And then on the team support, fundraising, grants, admin, internal resilience and equity. And this, I'm sure, if you're looking at this and you're thinking, this looks like a hierarchical chart, you just turn it sideways. What's the big deal, dude? There's an important observation in that, which is like, yes, we aren't fundamentally changing the way you think about everything. What we are changing is where decisions are made. So now the basic rule inside a circle structure like this is you make decisions with the fewest number of people possible, as close to the implementation of the decision, without excluding anyone who's impacted by it. So at the advocacy circle, when they're talking about what bills they're going to advocate for or write, they do that. They don't talk to anyone else, just the people on that circle. They determine the legislative priorities. But the moment that they make a decision that's going to impact the services and knowledge crew, if they're going to legislate, if they want to advocate for a piece of legislation, but in order to advocate for the piece of legislation, they're going to need the knowledge crew to write a report. Well, now they have to go and they have to do that in the community food justice circle to make sure that that's aligned. And similarly, the movement building crew, they're going to do their movement building work, but the moment they want to do something that's going to like reallocate resources radically through the organization and might make it harder to do advocacy, they have to do that in the next circle up. And the idea is, if you're going to look inside this crew's like org chart, there's very clearly defined zones where each group is making decisions and when they have to check in with other people. And then the basic rule is, if you as an individual are upset with the decision that's happening in another circle, you should join that circle. If you don't like how people are doing fundraising, then we need to make sure, and you're passionate about that, we need to get you on that fundraising circle. So it's taking everybody who's like, oh, I don't like that, and pointing the finger and saying, cool, let's just bring you into your power. And there's a lot of different ways, and we talk about the implementation, we'll talk about some more specifics. But the basic gist is you're just creating a circle. A circle is just a group of people that have fluid membership and a particular set of things that they are allowed to do without checking in with other people, not checking in with other circles. And then a role is a bucket of tasks associate, another, just back in the circles. People are on multiple circles. So it's, and that's another thing that's different. You're not, if you're in grants, you're not just a grant writer. You could be, but most people are on a couple different circles that take care of different elements of the things they're excited about bringing. And people can kind of move into those things. And then a role is a bucket of tasks associated with the responsibilities of a particular circle. And the people who hold a role, they also have a clear zone of autonomy and are accountable to their circles. So the fundraising circle, it's like a hat. Bucket's like a role is like a hat you wear. And people wear multiple hats inside of an organization. But you come to the fundraising circle and there's somebody who's working on, somebody who holds the big donor relationships, somebody who holds the small gift campaigns, the database management, donor acknowledgement. And these could, one person could hold 3 of these. There could be 5 people each who hold 1. And they come together and they make the decisions about the circle, about what happens with fundraising. And then their supervision is the circle level. The thing that says, hey, person who does corporate partnerships, did you do the thing you were going to do, isn't a manager. It's just the people in the circle. You said you were going to do a thing at last meeting, so we're going to have another meeting and we're going to ask you, did you do it? So there's like a natural accountability that's built into that work rhythm. And then people hold different roles throughout the organization. So if we look at like this, back to the circles thing, somebody might hold a lot of their work might be movement building. 75% of their work might be doing movement building, but they also hold some roles around internal resilience and equity. And they also hold a role helping with finance and admin. So they're kind of cross-pollinate, so they can be in those conversations. And then you can also be really flexible with how what work people take on and why. And one of the important values of this is you're not pigeonholed into a job description that as soon as you come into the organization, that's just your thing. You come into the organization, there's certain hats that have to be worn. You wear some of them. If you realize that you're really not liking one of the hats, you find a person to trade it with. If 2 of your hats you're really bad at, your organization just comes and says, hey, these 2 hats you're not doing well. So what training do you need or support do you need, or do we need to shift what hat you wear? It's not, let's make you leave the organization. And then if somebody, has a space for creativity, they want to contribute something to the organization that's beyond their job, they can create roles and do it. And we can go on for hours about this, but it's just the basic architecture: circles, spaces for decision-making, roles, little hats that you wear inside those things. And those are like the basic structural building blocks of a lot of things, and you can get really complex and really fun with all of it. Okay. We're still doing all right. I'm going to breeze through this one. Hierarchy. Hierarchy, people tend to have a lot of feelings about it, especially when we talk about like the politics of restructuring organizations. The reason that I like to talk about this is a lot of people are vehement, like we can't have hierarchy. I need a non-hierarchical organization. And oftentimes I see people who do that go too far toward naively non-hierarchical. Not only do they go too far toward naively non-hierarchical, they also fall into the trap of trying to create from a place of reactivity. You can't create, maybe you can. I'm not aware of how you can create something strictly by opposing something you don't like. To me, when people are in that mindset, I watch people do a lot of picking apart anything that's going to get created, even just because it's not perfect, because they can find something. So I think having a more nuanced understanding of what hierarchy is and a better language around is really supportive. So in this construction here, hierarchy is a system in which certain members or components of an organization defer to the authority of other members and components. So it's just a system, and it can be consensual. It's consensual deference. It's like, somebody else says something, I'm just going to assume I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it like that because they said it. And there's 5 types: strategic, in this construction: strategic, tactical, policy, and livelihood and cultural. And I'll kind of go through them. And the basic point is that all of these 5 types do exist. As far as I've seen, they just do exist inside of organizations. There are these systems of deference inside of organizations. Whether they're transparent and talked about is a different question. And the big thing is sometimes there's only one hierarchy and everybody's in the same relationship to each other in all of the hierarchies. So there's one, obviously you've noticed I like this little triangle shape. There's this the static hierarchy, and this hierarchy that you see on your org chart dictates all of the 5 hierarchies. This is gonna be easier to explain after I explain what they are. This is too abstract. I'm gonna do it. Cool. So strategic hierarchy, and I'll give you the slides, so I'll just go fast. Strategic hierarchy is about deference to who's deferring to who about the group's shared missions and goals. So you could be deferring to a single person, or you could have a body of 3 people, or you could have a document, but somewhere people are deferring to something about what it is we're doing here. What's our mission and what are our goals? And if they're not deferring to anything, if it's incredibly subtle, that things can kind of become disjointed. But there's something about deferring to and aligning behind a sense of what we're doing, the mission and goals, general initiatives. Then there's the tactical, which is like the specific tasks that will be accomplished. So an example of this is, I'm just gonna use the Law Center. So the Law Center, they have a general strategy of trying to increase grassroots fundraising. So they're less dependent on grants and large donors. So you have a general strategy that everybody's lined up behind. Then they had one person who was in charge of, for the sake of simplicity, they had one person who's in charge of the fall fundraiser, the fall in-person fundraiser. And at the fall in-person fundraiser, when the staff came to set up, that one person told everyone what to do. Said, you're the MC, you help with the tables, you do this, you do this, you do this. So that's that tactical hierarchy. There's one person who tells everybody exactly what tasks they're doing in order to accomplish a goal, which can be really helpful in situations. But the thing to notice in this one was the person who was in charge at the top of the tactical hierarchy was not the same person who was in charge of the strategic hierarchy. There's different flows of deference. And the person who was on top of that tactical hierarchy for that program was not on the top for some other program. So even though there was a strict hierarchy in place for a temporary period of time in a context around a program, and it was very useful, and people consensually deferred to that because they wanted to organize, you go into a different program, it's totally different thing. So there's different power dynamics. And that's one of the ways you can use hierarchy for its benefits of being able to coordinate while not reproducing a lot of the toxicity around it, though there's still nuance. Policy hierarchy is a system where you're deferring up to each other about the rules that apply to members of the organization. So who's setting the policies about how we work together. And again, it can be one person, it could be the HR department, however you want to define it. But and this is important because if there's a disagreement about how we work together and 2 people are in conflict, if you don't have a hierarchy, if you don't have some place where you've agreed to defer to, then it's really hard to resolve that conflict. But if you have a document that's like, hey, this is the thing, or you have a person that's like, this is the person, then if there's a disagreement, you work it out, and it helps things move. Livelihood is about the decisions that impact each other's ability to earn a livelihood now or in the future. So it's about compensation, promotion, that kind of thing. And cultural hierarchy, sometimes it's formal, it's more often more subtle. It's about where we're consciously or unconsciously deferring to each other about how to be together. And oftentimes if you have a CEO, it's like, this is the thing, this is the model of how we be, and they set the culture. But you can do it differently. You can intentionally play with that in lots of ways. And the basic gist here is these things are all useful. These systems of deference are really useful to help people coordinate, and being transparent about it can be really, really useful. If they're all the same, if there's one person who sets the strategy, tells people what to do, tells people how they're going to do it, makes the decisions about who's getting paid and promoted, and is the model for how you are together. If there's one person on top of that, or if one person is above someone else in all of those things, there's this really ripe availability for toxicity. Because if I'm below and I have an issue with strategy, or if I'm below and I don't like the tasks I'm being assigned because of this tactical thing in the tactical hierarchy, if I push against that person and they can fire me, that's probably not going to work. Or or it's similarly with the strategy. If it's like, if I want to push against a strategic decision, but if I offend that person, they might reduce my pay or give me bad jobs, it's not going to be fun for me. So the idea is to be able to be flexible and fluid with these things. And the question to ask is just, where's your strategy, your tactics, your policy, your livelihood decisions, and your culture, where are they sourced from inside your organization? And can you be more transparent? Oftentimes there's like in a POC led organization, there might be a unspoken desire for a cultural hierarchy where like the elders are the top of the cultural hierarchy. It might be unspoken that everybody thinks that we're all looking to them about how we be. So it's not about like no hierarchy. It's about like, great, just say that. Say like, this is the system we have for how we be, and this is how we do it. And then you can kind of build it out. And then it'll be more stable over time. And then if new people who come in, it'll be easier for them to understand how to operate inside of it. Cool. All right, I'm doing okay with time. So if we want to have maybe a couple comments here, a little bit of a moment, and then we can talk about a couple real world examples. But how is this landing?
Do we want folks to unmute, or do you want folks to continue in the chat?
Oh, if we want, maybe if there's one or two unmute, that would be great. And if people want to drop in the chat, that would be great too. But I'd love to hear from people just to be as close to in the room together as we can.
Any thoughts or reflections from anyone? Questions?
I love the circles and roles thing. I love it. There's a lot here to really unpack, because, I work with Ray at the city, and even being inside city government is totally new for me, because I used to be in a nonprofit, which actually, looking back on it, I think now about like what I was experiencing right up until where I left was just like solid white dominant culture stuff in a restructuring that was making it extremely difficult for staff to feel empowered. And it was like, so all of everything that you've been saying for this last period of time really resonates with me because of those issues.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this because I think, so I have a background in the performing arts, and I run a small performing arts organization, and we have all volunteer led kind of projects. But I've seen in the performing arts that a dominant model that is used is one that lends itself to lots of abuse if the person at the top is an abuser of power. And that's not only like really common, but it's really accepted, that sometimes people having very mercurial attitudes and very abusive ways of talking with other people is just part of the creative process, which is something that we've really wanted to reject, but I think haven't had the vocabulary or examples of how to run things differently. And in the meantime, things still have to be run and organized. And so I really liked going through the different kinds of hierarchies and showing how it's not that hierarchy goes away in general, it's that it becomes more flattened, and that the way you organize and create accountability is by making sure that not one person has control over the entire thing, and that there's kind of like a series of checks and balances where people feel like they don't have to defer to one personality who's directing the whole show and whose whims and desires are more important than everybody else's personal needs. So I really like that. It gave me a lot to think about, because I think we've known what we didn't want, but we haven't yet seen any functional models that we know of. I'm not saying they're not there or that we've even tried to research them, but we're just kind of like, okay, but what's the next step? So this was really helpful. It gave me ideas for how to approach and think about how we set things up.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really great. The performing arts one is that's really juicy. It reminds me also, I work with some groups that are kind of like spiritual education communities, which is one where having a clear hierarchy, like I'll play with the arts one. It's like having a director there's like a hierarchical relationship there can be helpful for organizing a play. But then if the director's like also the CEO, you're in trouble. But if you can allow that director to be the top of the hierarchy in one situation, but not in another, then the power trip breaks down. I know this is what you're saying. I'm just vibing with you on it. It's like it breaks it down because now they've differentiated the role from the identity, and now you have to be at the will of someone else's power who is at your will, and all of a sudden everybody starts learning how to be better leaders and followers out of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think I think like it makes sense of spiritual education that abuse is just rampant in that environment as well. But I think we can do better. And yeah, I'm feeling like there's some tools for ideas of how to make that happen. And some of them I see that we've been doing intuitively, but it gives me ideas for how to codify those things and also how to solicit feedback from people we work with about, and perhaps that I'm not the person to solicit feedback as a founder. So I heard that, Estella, and I was like, yes. One thing we do for that is we always gather anonymous feedback after our projects, where people know that the feedback is anonymous, so that people can say what they want, knowing that we'll get it, but that we won't know who it came from. So they feel some safety there. Anyway, thank you. This has been really interesting for me and really thought-provoking.
So cool. Let's do some examples. Talk about some things that people have been doing. Want to get the shares happening. You can see now. Yeah. Thanks. Oh, and the websites I dropped in there are good places to just look at the that are more detailed on circles and roles. So holacracy and sociocracy, like those are great places to get. Those are the most developed places that I've seen that are thinking and teaching about circles and roles. They're not as developed. Holacracy certainly is not particularly developed in some of the cultural awarenesses and power awarenesses that we're talking about here. I would say problematically under so. Sociocracy, the community is a little bit better, but not particularly express about it. But it's great. They're great tools. I've experienced them as such. Okay. I'm going to come back to this 1DC one. Should I do it? Yeah. Okay. We're going to do it. So I'll get somebody else's voice in here. So 1DC is organization, a kind of community empowerment, anti-gentrification organization, kind of fully Black led in the District of Columbia. And I'm going to share, if I can, just a couple minutes of a presentation that was done for the Nonprofit Democracy Network when we had them come talk, by Jessica Gordon Nebhard. Some people probably know of her. She done done a lot of work in the history of cooperatives in the Black community. And I was like, oh, and I asked her, I was like, how can we share some of your story and with this community? And what we came up with was sharing her voice directly. So she gave like a whole like hour and a half long thing, and I just wanted to share a few of her, a little bit of what she shared about why they formalized and some of the values. They have
a really deep cut of articulation of like the values of the why, and you'll see how they're both strong and also very culturally specific in terms of like what united and their community in terms of the politics that they had. And also, if you're like me, you'll learn cool things about the my sentence trailed off. I learned a lot from this, so I'm happy to be able to share it. Cool. And I think it'll share the audio. So if somebody just gives me a thumbs up that you can hear it.
No follow-up?
No, that there was a thank you for that. I have another one about the difference between the board's composition, other than the working board versus governance body, or maybe say a little more about what a working board is for y'all, or what the difference between your former board and the current and the
Part of shared leadership, so that when we moved to shared leadership, people didn't feel like we were making.
I'm gonna, this slide, just so you see it, this is some of their observations. They had the same realization. They were like, oh, we want to switch into something formal, but we're already doing half of this stuff. So this is Jessica, like finishing up saying some of the stuff that they already did, and then talking about like why they formalized and how.
A huge jump. So in the board side, when we moved from the CDC to 1DC, the board composition changed to be a lot more working class, long-term members, people who had already been on projects that the CDC was doing, who are now able to be involved with our board, and I'll explain that in a minute. So then the question was, so why do we want to formalize, what was this, 2011 or something? Why do we need to formalize shared leadership now if we're already practicing some things of shared leadership? And so the issues that came up were gender balance, right? We had the new board with community people, community activists, was tended to be more working class Black women, and some people weren't sure about how that worked, right? And then sometimes the few men who were still on still kind of acted more patriarchal and right, didn't always listen to the women, that kind of thing. So we had a gender balance challenge. We wanted to enhance the responsibility, a sense of group responsibility of everybody, right? The staff, the working board, and any active members. And so we thought that having a more shared leadership would enhance that, and people feeling more accountable and more responsible if they felt like they also had more say. We also felt that we needed more information sharing. If we really wanted to be a strong, robust, long-lasting organization, the information couldn't be held in the EDs, you know, by the ED and maybe some key staff people and maybe a board. Everybody to know more about the information, how we raise money, why we raise money, what we're doing, how we make decisions, be part of those group decisions, and again, to enhance the group responsibility. And then we also realized that as long as we had an ED and the typical board structure, we were still having a hierarchical organization, even though all of our mission and values were about undermining hierarchy and empowering people and democratic grassroots leadership, right? But our organizational structure wasn't really reflecting that. So we wanted to really live our values. And so I tried to put all of 1DC's values because they're really beautiful. And this, I can't even take any credit. That community board and some of the staff helped to put this together. But one of the things we realized was we weren't living these values if we continued to have a hierarchical structure. So the Ella Baker value, grassroots democratic leadership, the Mother Jones value, grassroots organizing and strategic hell raising, Denmark Vesey value, sharing power and resources for collective liberation, Standing Bear, the right to indigenous culture and stewardship of the land, Ida B. Wells, expose injustice, raise consciousness, affirm human dignity. These are all on our website if you want to find them, 1dconline.org. Nanny Helen Burroughs, education, collective work and cooperation. Claudia Jones, internationalism, solidarity with liberation movements around the world. And then we had a statement about we value live spirits and collective personhood, unique human potential to organize for social change and justice, the work of the poor, oppressed, disenfranchised, free expression of human love, sexuality, art, culture, and language, right? That we support. And now we say shared leadership team. We actually didn't have that language in our original vision. But our members, our supporters, I think we had our board in there, and our staff stand firm and bear witness to creating a just, fair, and equitable DC. And we want to, create a caring society and community for all. So we felt that shared leadership really was needed in order for us to really live those principles. I'm going to skip the Ella Jo Baker quote, but it's a quote again about radical change, and that, right, all of us need to be involved. Poor and oppressed people need to be the ones to make and demand radical change. And radical change meaning getting down to understand the root causes of injustice and oppression. So we started to have those kinds of conversations. What would shared leadership mean? How do we already practice it? Why should we change? What do we need to change? We created a committee that then started to do research. And at every monthly board meeting, we talked about, and we always had staff at the board meetings. That's another thing we should have put in what we already did.
They wanted to share their values, and 1DC went through I think almost a year of just learning first, which is the part she would talk about. I think she talks about it next, but did a ton of research and came up with a whole series of different things they might do. They went really in, and which was partially necessary because they have a pretty large constituency, so they really wanted to have something that they could really drive and really unite people behind as well. Oh man, okay, it's late. I'm gonna go a couple minutes over, and people need to drop off. They can drop off. And I do want to just speak to these things a little bit more. I wish I could spend a little more time with each thing. One of the things that they did, they put a lot of their decision-making power in the board, and then they got people who represented their community on the board. The people from the neighborhoods they were organizing were the people on the board, and then they trained those people to be able to be on the board, which is different from other organizations which instead try to have not powerful boards. One example is Rise Up Kingston. This is, again, a locally based movement building organization. They work on a network of different issues, and they have a different circle for each issue area. And then what they did was they have a board and a stewardship circle, and their board of directors exists to help RUC stay functional and tend to how RUC works. So they're in some ways hold the human resources element of things. They're really working on organizational processes and that kind of thing, but they're not working on the strategic direction as much. That's where the stewardship circle is. And the stewardship circle has some staff and a lot of community representation. And that's, so the stewardship circle is the top of the strategic hierarchy. And it's also in some ways the top of the cultural hierarchy. And the board is the top of the policy hierarchy. So these two things flow together, and then they populate the board with people who carry particular types of expertise and a pretty extensive ability to be able to show up. And they have a pretty intensive kind of working board. Stewardship circle, there's some members of the board, there's some members of the community that all they do is sit on the stewardship circle. All they do is say, this is what the community needs. And then there's some people from the various circles who come in and align the organization. So you kind of have these two things. So neither of these things is the top of a hierarchy. And for all of y'all who are thinking about, what about the fiduciary duties and roles of the board? it is totally legal. And if we had 10 minutes, I would explain it, but it's not the most interesting bit. Just wanted to kind of point to this as an example of a creative way to flow. Another example is the Center for Jewish Nonviolence. So they have a really interesting policy hierarchy, a really interesting flow of who gets to say what. And they have 3 relevant bodies inside of who says what about the organization. They're fiscally sponsored. They don't have a board, but they have a steering committee that has high level decisions, budget, large changes, legal compliance, the kinds of, that's where they locate directive power. So the power to tell someone what they can and cannot do is primarily the steering committee. And the steering committee is populated by some members of staff and some volunteers. And they're really intentional about the power dynamics of who's represented there and which ones of their circles are represented. Then they have an internal resilience circle, which is like inside the organization, thinking of ways to develop the organization. Anytime they come up with an idea that doesn't require anything, they can just implement it. And often they're coming up with ideas that might require people, but they'll do all the legwork of researching and developing this thing. And then they'll just double check it with steering. And steering committee holds and then the Gender Power Safety Squad, because they really wanted to push into how gender power and safety were showing up. So that crew has a significant amount of power over a very particular area. So they can design and implement any intervention they want regarding those things. All they have to, as long as it doesn't require people to do things, they just have to, so they can just do that. If they want to do shifts that are going to shift other things in the organization, they just check in with the internal resilience crew just about like process wise, how should we do this? And they have a special power to implement individual requirements. So they can tell one person, this is what you are doing. And they just have to get the steering committee's go ahead to make sure that everything's kind of compliant. But so essentially what it did was it created a small group of people who are all women or gender non-conforming, who are the center of power in responding to acute gender issues. And they've created that location for themselves. And then these 3 bodies all talk to each other. So again, that's just like another example of how to do that. And you can see, so you kind of can keep the steering committee as like this body that who knows how good the gender consciousness of that steering committee is. Hopefully it's improving with every day and hopefully it's good. But even if it isn't, if there's a acute thing that occurs, it's not that body that's the response body. There's a body that has a high level of commitment and integrity around that. That's the primary response body. Oh, I thought I had some. So a couple common things just to note for as you go on, other than adorable pictures of meerkats. As people do step into structures, and I'll send a link with some of this written out. Informal hierarchies happen all the time. So you break down a formal hierarchy and all of a sudden there's some informal thing and you're not really talking about it. So the best thing to do is just not pretend like it's not there. The moment you pretend like everything's flat, we have circles and roles and everything's great and everything's equal, then you're just getting yourself ready to gaslight your whole organization. It's more like, oh, we have circles and roles and we're doing something different. Now we have a new environment in which to navigate our relationships. We have new possibilities. Now let's try to do it. That spirit is honest and generative. They're like, it's all perfect. It gets weird fast. The different needs for support we mentioned earlier. It's some people you say, here's the basic job, go do your thing, create. And they're like, yes, I've always wanted this. And some people are like, I don't get this. Some people are like, last time I did this, some really ridiculous racist things happen. So I'm gonna need us to be clear that that's not gonna happen. I'm gonna need proof to be able to do that. So there are these different, and some people are like, oh, I've always done this and nobody ever checks me on it. Nobody ever feels like they can. So I'm just gonna, there's all these different things. So different forms of support. Change brings up feels for everyone. People, you're gonna discover who is attached to their role, who is attached to their different way of being, different way of working. So really making sure your process has space to be with those feels. And then another thing that's really common is questions about where grant decisions are made. Oftentimes we're going to do circles. Who's going to write the grant? Is it going to be inside the program circle, or we're going to have separate people do it? And they got to get creative, or else you can kind of get stuck in the same position of wherever inside your structure has the line to the money. is overly influential in terms of the way the rest of the organization works. So there's different ways to design for that. And with that, that is the end of all of these slides. I'm available to hang out for a little bit, I think, and ask questions. And I also want to respect people who had hard stops. And I will turn it over to Stella.
Well, thank you, everyone. Simon, thank you. That was incredibly informative. And I'm super grateful for just the shared knowledge, and, want to make sure people know that Simon does have a consulting agency, so he is able to support folks if they want to go further into this work. Definitely someone who's been an incredible resource for our organization, and who I'm seeking support from in order to continue to go in this direction. And it's just wonderful to just have that resource available. So I wanted to make sure everyone is aware of that. And thank you all for joining. I hope that you enjoyed the workshop, and I hope we can have Simon back again as part of these workshops that we do with the city, if we continue to do them in the coming year. And I think we have one more session this year. I can't believe it went by so quick, but I think we have one more session coming up. So be on the lookout for that. And yeah, thank you all for joining. I think we'll hang out for a few minutes, Simon, if that's okay, if anyone wanted to ask you anything directly or get information. And then I will get some of the additional resources and PowerPoint from Simon. So we'll be sharing that, as well as sharing the recorded session with everyone who registered. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate y'all. It's so cool, this whole framework, the whole like getting nonprofits together with the city to have collective knowledge, that whole model. That's cool. I don't know if I've ever seen anybody do that.
Yeah, it's been really great. Shout out to Ray if he's still on there. He's really been super instrumental in just really going out and asking what organizations want and need, and letting the folks doing the work and kind of inform what type of programming the city's been offering. And it's been so helpful. We've just seen a lot of growth this year, and it couldn't have come sooner, right? Because it was such a crazy year for all of us. So it's been really awesome to to have that, and we're super excited. Megan is actually our Megan, I always butcher the title, so I don't, maybe you could say what that is, but I'm super excited to have her on board as well, because she's been someone who also has that interest in terms of, working with organizations and seeing what's needed and seeing how we bridge that between city and community work that's being done. But yeah, I'm so sorry, Megan. I always butcher the title. I mix it all up.
We've been talking a little bit about that. So the full title is Culture and Creative Economy Manager. And so our whole office, the Office of Arts and Culture, is a division inside Convention and Cultural Services. So right in that, that hierarchy, this is really fascinating. But it's been really super cool to get to know folks. And I had been sort of eyeing a little bit of this, the New Economy Coalition and Sustainable Economies Law Center, and beginning to think about, how do we look at space and collective ownership and things like that. And so when I saw this on the list, because it was, Ray, as you pointed out, did a great job working with all of you to set this up. I was just like, amazing. I really want to go to this. And it really absolutely outstanding. I think there's lots of opportunity for more conversation around this.
Cool.
Yeah, thank you. We're part of both, the Nonprofit and Democracy Network, that's part of SELC, and then we're part of New Economy Coalition as well. So we have one of our collective members who's one of the staff there, and so we're brought into those. So it's just amazing, right, to have like these national conversations around all of this. And so we've been, trying to figure out how locally, like, we can help spread some of that information, because I think it's so helpful. And I think right now is really like a great time for it. Maybe 5 years ago, I don't think our city was ready even for what I was doing in terms of having 15 years ago, it definitely wasn't having a collective model and speaking on it. But I think it really is a great time to have these conversations, because people are really looking for these different options and alternatives that are more aligned with our values. And so I just think that, the work that they've been doing, in both of those organizations, is so detailed and has the history and it has the background and it has the theory and the practices that I think allow us not to have to reinvent the wheel and to really just tap into it. And then it's been incredible that a lot of those organizations, like I put in the chat, have been sharing the documents that they've been creating as they're designing and coming up with different things that work. They're sharing them so we have access, like through the Nonprofit Democracy Network, to this incredible Google Drive that allows you to see what other people have come up with for these structures and how they're setting up their boards, which allows us to kind of take a peek into and then help us in designing what we're doing. So I think it's an incredible resource, and I'm really happy I got to share it with other nonprofit organizations in our city, because I think it's going to be super helpful as folks start thinking about designing something that makes sense for them, and makes sense for their community and for the people that they're serving and the people who are part of that work.
That's like close to what before the. So in the network we did these two big gatherings, and part of like what and then we did a couple little small things, but part of what we were feeling like that the next best expression of it is like way more locally based, because when we did our Oakland thing we kind of pulled from around everywhere, but then when we pulled from people from all across the country showed up, and then but afterward the thing that people felt like what is the most impactful was like the sense of a lot of what people thought was really impactful was the sense of community, the sense of like, oh, we're not in this together, we're not crazy out doing whatever, we're just and the support, and then the even beyond just the drafting of documents, that real like, how do we navigate, how exactly do I exist again, that like being together in that process. So we were thinking of like wanting to go, and we were exploring in a couple of different cities, going and trying to get a group of organizations from that area to come together and do some of the creative process and organizational change inside, and then so it'd be easier to leave that community with like a home base of like, oh, and there's relationships, and it's like people who already have relationships, we're just solidifying and transforming them.
Yeah, and honestly, that's what we're craving. I mean, that's definitely, I think when I went there, I honestly cried. I was like, oh my God, there's other people doing like the crazy shit we've been trying to do for 15 years, and really like diving into this, right? And really exploring like better ways of having these structures and making things work and providing the work. And so I really cried. I mean, like, I remember me and Dia, who was part of our team, like, we were just like, oh my God, there's other people doing this. We thought we were like the only ones trying to like create this collective model and trying to make it work for people, and caring about our staff and caring, so I think that that's really needed. It's part of the like selfish reason that I wanted to have the conversation locally, because I do feel like, sometimes I am like talking about these things that people locally are just like, what, we're used to this different model of 501c3s. And so it's been really important to figure out how to get more of that information locally, because we are plugged into these national networks, right? And it's incredible to have that, like to have that community nationally, but I definitely don't feel like we have that community locally. And so I'm really excited that you're talking about that, because I hope that, maybe with this introduction, like folks are more interested, and, we have different, local nonprofits, definitely around social justice, but in the arts, who want to learn more and build community around, navigating, that restructuring. So that's exciting to hear, Simon. I definitely would love to support in whatever capacity with that.
Yeah.
And then statewide, I know that it's wanted. I work with different foundations. So statewide, I know the California Endowment, it's something that I've talked to them about, and just offering it to already grassroots organizations who are doing the same thing we did for years, which was trying to really fit in and struggling to describe this to funders of how we operated and how things were more rooted in our cultural ways, or in, rooted in our community values, and trying to like make that fit as people of color within this other model, and just how difficult that could be. So they were really interested also in looking at that. So I'd love to just explore that as well, because I think statewide, I think there's other organizations that I think would really benefit as well. I want to take a quick second. I know we're over time. I want to take a quick second to just introduce Jesus and Ruby. Jesus is our community wellness director.
He's been working with us for years, but just recently came on full time as a community wellness director. He's incredible. He's a LMFT, so it's incredible to have someone in, with that clinical background, but he's also a artist and he's a community healer. So he's also part of our cultural community and our arts community. And it's just really beautiful to have someone at the intersection of those things to help lead our programming there. And Ruby's an incredible person. She came in first as a high school intern, and 10 years later, she's our executive assistant. And someone who's moving into the leadership of the organization and is really interested in learning, the back end of it and how things function and run, to really help lead in that capacity. So I just wanted to take a quick minute to introduce them, Ray, and to Simon and to Megan, who have been incredible. And I'm sure, you all get a chance to see them again, but just wanted to quickly introduce some of the folks from our team at Soul Collective.
Hello. No, thank you. I'm reflecting a lot in, working the last 8 years heavily in social work. So looking at these models and, just thinking about, I worked for, the hardest place to work with was actually with a bunch of social workers, right? And so that constant shift, right? And then being a cultural worker and having, our education and having to make this shift and really take inventory. And I couldn't help, of course, also think of family systems. So I'm just reflecting a lot on that and wanting to, continue to grow together in our collective. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very nice to meet you all. Definitely a lot of reflection on my end as well, especially in having conversations with Estella all the time about how our models are always changing and how we're just always adopting new things. And I found it extremely beneficial to go over this circles and roles, just because we're even thinking about okay, we have different many hats in our collective. So it's just really trying to settle into okay, how can we have both roles in a way, but also be so flexible to kind of jump in other roles as well. So just thinking a lot about that. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. And these topics have been really interesting. Estella, you and Katie have done a great job of putting together topics that we don't get to talk about normally or in a certain way. Simon, that we recorded this, and we're going to post it on our website, but a couple people have asked for that PowerPoint. Are you comfortable with us posting that as well?
Yeah.
You can say no, it's okay. But yeah. All right, if you get that to Estella.
Yeah, I'll send it.
Thanks.
So one of the things that I've been thinking about or processing a little bit is how does this play out? I've seen some things posted to my LinkedIn recently about grant makers and, how does that kind of fit in, or what are you asking people? And it's so funny because I just feel like some of this stuff is particularly very early on when you were talking about best practices and how best practices sort of get identified or sort of indoctrinated into the way that people do things, but you don't ever necessarily unpack and say, why is that the case? And how can we think about asking better questions, that are just more so these are just a lot of things that are kind of running through my head, the idea of well, deadlines. And that's so totally a white dominant culture thing. And how do you deal with that? Or can you do something that, obviously you have to have a process to be able to get through and review these things, but seeing rolling deadlines and sort of embracing that as something so that you don't, if you you got to be in the know in order to and if you're traditionally disconnected from some of those things, how does that affect you? And so, sometimes when the information starts to get out there, so these are just all things that are just rolling around in my head right now and are thinking through well, how does that practice fit, or what does that look like? And I don't know, really helpful to hear from you.
Yeah. Have you fallen down the nonprofit industrial complex revolution won't be funded wormhole yet?
Not quite yet, but I might be headed that way. Does it sound like I'm headed that way?
It's
No?
a good one. It's a good wormhole. It's a good buzzword to like go in, and then there's groups like Shake the Foundations or Solidaire. There's a whole space of people, and for me the like the space of the analysis of the things, the nonprofit industrial complex is usually a good portal. And I also wanted to express to Estelle and Jesus and Ruby, I'm so excited to come and be able to spend more time with you all. I'm like, every time I get to work with organizations, I get to like see their creativity and see their wisdom and see all of that. And like I got to hang out with I don't know if I met Ruby or Jesus. I don't think we met. But it was so much fun to come just for a day and like to just catch the vibe of what y'all are holding down, and to be able to like see how the depth of like healing and the depth of like creative expression and art and the lineages that y'all are carrying are like sorting themselves out in the expression of the thing. I feel like simultaneously like humbled and like a really like giddy child. Just really like excited. So I'm really appreciative to be able to connect with you all. I'm really curious, and I'm really just have like, and also like the wellness direct, like what was the title that you're using right now? Wellness director?
Wellness director.
I feel like that's part of where people are heading, is like, I feel like that's part of this like brink of like, hey, like y'all know we always had healers, right? So like, let's still do that.
And we're dancing and we're navigating, and we're really grateful for the learning because it does give us that language to explain it. We've always had healers, like in the 15 years. Art, culture, activism, social justice has always been intertwined. There's no difference like with us for what that means. So when we look at that arts and cultural component, like we can't look at it without looking at the social justice need and the community healing portion. It's just intertwined with the work. That's why I like what we're doing right now with giving out food boxes and looking at people's mental health and adding art to it. Like it all just makes sense to us. There's no, right through our cultural perspective, that's just, it's intertwined. So it really is great to, I think we're just in a space as an organization where we really are using that language as tools to be able to like clearly explain to other folks who don't understand our traditions and our background and what our worldview is, like this is what we're doing. Jesus is great because he's at the intersection of those. And I think we almost need those, right? Like if we're going to introduce these different healers and we're going to have these different folks, he's always been a consultant for us to make sure that, programming and things that we're doing are going to be beneficial, to community, and that we're not accidentally, bringing up more trauma. So it's helped keep us informed with the programming that we're doing. And so having him on really is part of just that, really being intentional and clear about who we are as an organization and, the wisdom that we bring through our culture and our tradition. And so I'm super excited to like be able to share that with other organizations that are led by people of color, because I feel like we've had to kind of shy away from who we really are out in the community and with funders, because we think it's going to not be understood, or it's not going to be valued, or it's going to be looked at as non-professional. And so part of the work that I've been really trying to do is shifting that culture and shifting that narrative around that. We have support from folks like the California Endowment around shifting that narrative. It's amazing to have funders who understand that and get that, and like they want to back us in doing more of that. But part of that is that. So I really see like the work that you're doing. So I'm super excited because it gives us like a toolkit, and it helps us to rethink as well. It just brings a bunch of information to us that it's just great. I feel like it's going to help us along the process faster rather than trying to figure it out all on our own and trying to reinvent the wheel. Like it's really wonderful. So we're just as giddy and excited to work with you more this coming year. And I'm just super excited, Megan, that you're interested in these things and that, you see value in them from a city level, because I don't think we, sharing with our team that I don't think we've had that, prior to Ray, like just really showing interest and really, I think showing folks in the community that are coming from, who are POC administrators, like equal respect, like really hasn't happened prior to both of you all here. Like we haven't really felt that level of like folks really seeing us for who we are and what we're bringing to the table. So I'm super excited to have these conversations on the city level as well. Yeah, and I'm grateful for the opportunity of just being able to share the kind of work that we're doing and the folks that we're working with, with other people in the city. And so I hope it really does create a local conversation and a local narrative shift around really seeing, folks like Shona and folks like Abraham and like different, folks who are leading in our city and have been for decades, and who maybe have not been seen as professional because we have a different way of doing things, to really see the wisdom and the work that they've been doing for decades in our city and the impact that they've been having. So I think all of that is part of these different conversations of really looking at, unpacking, white dominance and how that shows up in organizations and organizational structure. So super exciting. I did not think 15 years ago I would be having these types of conversations at this level. So it's definitely like a full circle for me to just be able to do this and to really continue to show up as our authentic selves and have that be appreciated and valued. So thank you all for that.
Yeah, and just thank you, I think, for validating just the level of code switching that goes on for us in this work, right? From working with our community and having a particular language so that they're engaged, and then how do we engage folks outside of the community, particularly funders who want to hear, the buzzwords like on moving trains, particularly within mental health. So it's that constant, dance. And so, yeah, to hear that is validating that, we're not the only ones experiencing it, that some language is valued. And then, I think me and Stella were just talking about it a couple of days ago, like how, at times we find ourselves, well, maybe I won't say it in this way, right? The way we say it. So, yeah, I'm reflecting on all of that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Hey, Seuss, I have just a number of things. I have on the arts and health front, because I've been working on that for the past 6 or 7 years, lots of stuff to share. So I will, if you shoot me your email address, I'll follow up with some stuff.
Yeah, here is my email. Feel free to contact me. All right.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. I'm going to go off to another meeting at 12:30, and I appreciate everyone taking so much time, in space with each other. Thank you. And yeah, hopefully we can continue these conversations.
Yeah. Keep me in the loop whenever is useful, and I'll talk to you later.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.